Hello, my friend. Tonight we're going to pull back the heavy velvet curtains on a practice so strange, so intimate, and so politically charged that it feels like something out of a fever dream. You find yourself standing in the flickering candlelight of a royal bedchamber, the air thick with the scent of beeswax and lavender. You can almost hear the soft rustle of silk and the nervous breathing of the people gathered in the shadows. We're going deep into the heart of the Tudor court, a world where the most private act of a king and queen was transformed into a very public spectacle. You might think you know all there is to know about the Tudors, but trust me, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're watching as the king and queen are led to their marriage bed, not by a single servant, but by a procession of the most powerful people in the land. This isn't just a bedtime ritual, it's a profound political statement. The most bizarre sexual practice of Tudor kings wasn't some hidden kink or secret affair, but the public witnessing of the consummation of their royal marriages. This wasn't done for cheap thrills. It was a cold, hard political necessity. Think about it. A king's power, his dynasty, and the stability of an entire nation rested on the simple fact that he could produce a legitimate heir. And how do you prove that legitimacy beyond a shadow of a doubt? You have a team of highly witnesses watch the marriage act itself, or, at the very least, they observe the couple being tucked into bed and then presented with the evidence the following morning. It's like a macabre version of I Spy for the most powerful people in the world. This wasn't a one-time thing, either. It was a formal, institutionalized practice, especially for marriages that were crucial diplomatic alliances. Historians still argue whether the witnesses literally watched the entire act or simply saw the couple get into bed and then came back later. Either way, the psychological pressure must have been immense. Can you imagine trying to be intimate with your new spouse while a bishop, an earl, and a few high-ranking courtiers are waiting just outside the curtains, ready to inspect the sheets? It's a surreal image, a blend of statecraft and bedroom farce. The goal was to leave no room for doubt, no opportunity for an enemy to later claim the marriage was never consummated, and therefore any children were illegitimate. This was the ultimate insurance policy for a dynasty's survival. For a Tudor king, the bedroom was just another war room, and the marriage bed another throne. You can almost feel the stifling tension in the room. The air is heavy, not with passion, but with expectation. The onlookers aren't there to be entertained. They're there to perform a solemn duty. This was a mainstream historical fact that underpinned the entire concept of royal succession. A fringe tidbit. The witnesses, especially the women, would often bring their own linens to compare with the ones from the marriage bed to ensure no trickery was afoot. You can almost hear the whispering, "Oh, Lady Anne, is that not the finest damask you've ever seen? Do you think the king?" Oh, never mind. The whole affair was a strange mixture of the sacred and the profane, of high politics and low gossip. It was a world where a king's virility was a matter of national security, and a queen's chastity was the cornerstone of an empire. So, you're now a silent observer, a ghost in the chamber, watching this incredible and incredibly awkward historical moment unfold before you. The practice wasn't invented by the Tudors, but they perfected it as a tool of political theatre. Its roots can be traced to European nobility, particularly in German territories, where the legitimacy of a marriage could be a matter of life or death, both for the couple and for the realm. The Tudors, as a new dynasty, were acutely aware of their fragile legitimacy. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, had seized the throne by force. He understood that every possible measure had to be taken to secure his family's place in history. He used this practice to ensure that his son Arthur's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was seen by all as valid. He wanted no one to ever question the union, and by extension, the future of the Tudor line. It was a calculated move, a cold, hard piece of statecraft disguised as a celebratory ritual. It's a bit like having your board of directors in the room for your first date. A laughably awful analogy, perhaps, but it captures the sheer absurdity of it all. This was a world where privacy was a luxury only commoners could afford. For royalty, every single moment of their lives, from birth to death, was a performance, and this, you see, was the climax of the show. It was all for show, yes, but a show with the highest of stakes. The heavy oak bed looms large in the center of the room, a veritable stage for this bizarre ritual. You can feel the deep, hushed reverence surrounding it, almost as if it's an altar rather than a piece of furniture. This wasn't just any bed. It was often an elaborately carved, four-poster affair, draped with expensive silks and tapestries. The mattress itself might have been stuffed with swan feathers, a luxury few others in the kingdom could afford. The Tudors understood the power of symbolism, and the royal marriage bed was a powerful symbol indeed. It represented the future of the dynasty, the literal crucible of succession. You're not just looking at a bed, you're looking at a piece of state machinery, a meticulously crafted prop in the grand drama of power. Imagine the king and queen, newlywed, being led to this impressive piece of carpentry. They've just been through a long day of ceremonies, feasts, and public appearances. The last thing they probably want is to be tucked into bed by a crowd of onlookers. Yet, here they are, performing their duty. The process was formalized, almost a liturgical dance. The couple would be undressed, often by their closest attendants, and given a special drink. Not wine to get them frisky, mind you, but a concoction believed to boost fertility. It was called cordial, a spiced, warm beverage, sometimes made with wine or ale and thickened with eggs and bread. The queen's cordial was often prepared with an extra dose of spices, thought to be beneficial for conception, a fringe tidbit, a small act of superstition woven into the grand tapestry of royal life. The entire ritual was designed to leave no room for doubt. The witnesses weren't just standing around, they were actively involved. They would offer toasts to the couple, sing bawdy songs, yes, really, and generally try to create a festive, if incredibly awkward, atmosphere. The goal was to remove any hint of a sham. Historians still argue whether the witnesses stayed in the room for the entirety of the act, or if they were merely present for the bedding ceremony itself and then returned the next morning. It's one of those tantalizing historical ambiguities that makes the past so fascinating. Either way, the political weight of their presence was what mattered. It was their testimony that would later be used to legitimize the marriage and any future offspring. You might be thinking, this is insane. Who would ever agree to this? But remember, for the Tudors, marriage wasn't about love. It was about power. This was a mainstream historical fact that governed every royal union. The individuals involved were secondary to the stability of the state. A princess was a political chess piece, a walking treaty. Her body was not her own. It belonged to her family and her country. The consummation was the final signature on that treaty. The witnesses were there to make sure the ink was dry. The entire event was less about romance and more about a corporate merger, with the king and queen as the unwilling CEOs. It's a bit like having your board of directors in the room for your first date. A laughably awful analogy, perhaps, but it captures the sheer absurdity of it all. This was a world where privacy was a luxury only commoners could afford. For royalty, every single moment of their lives, from birth to death, was a performance, and this, you see, was the climax of the show. The witnesses weren't just random bystanders. They were carefully chosen, usually from the highest ranks of the nobility and the church. Their social standing gave their testimony weight, making it difficult for anyone to later dispute their claims. This was a crucial part of the political theatre. Their presence transformed a private act into a public record. The king, as the supreme authority, had the ultimate responsibility. The pressure on him to perform was enormous. His virility wasn't just a personal attribute. It was a matter of national security. A failed consummation could lead to an annulment, a succession crisis, and possibly a civil war. For the king, this was the moment of truth, a test of his body and his power. For the queen, a young bride often far from home, the experience must have been one of quiet terror and profound vulnerability. She was not just a person, she was a vessel for the future of the dynasty, and this moment was the ultimate confirmation of her purpose. The bed, once a place of comfort and rest, was now an arena, and they were both performing for an audience of their peers and for the annals of history itself. The next morning, the air still crackles with nervous energy. You're now an observer in the outer chamber, waiting with the rest of the court for the final act of this strange drama. The consummation itself was only half the story. The real proof came with the sheet. This wasn't just any piece of linen. It was a pristine, white sheet, carefully chosen and placed on the bed for this specific purpose. When the doors of the royal bedchamber finally open, a servant emerges, not with a breakfast tray, but with this sheet held aloft for all to see. The entire court, from the highest-ranking nobles to the lowliest servants, holds its collective breath. The stained sheet became a powerful political symbol. For a Tudor queen, a blood-stained sheet was the ultimate proof of her virginity and the king's virility. It was a tangible, undeniable piece of evidence that the marriage had been officially, physically, and legally consummated. This was a mainstream historical fact that secured alliances and silenced dissent. A clean sheet, on the other hand, was a disaster. It could lead to accusations of impotence on the part of the king, or a lack of virginity on the part of the queen. Either way, it was a political crisis of the highest order. The sheet wasn't just a piece of laundry. It was the final, non-negotiable contract clause of a royal treaty. The ceremony of presenting the sheet was a moment of profound relief and triumph for the new dynasty. You can feel the collective sigh of the court as the evidence is displayed. The nobles and ambassadors would then sign an official document, a sort of affidavit attesting to the consummation. This document would be filed away, ready to be used as legal proof if anyone ever dared to challenge the legitimacy of the marriage, or its future offspring. It was a painstaking, almost paranoid process, but it was born from a deep-seated fear of dynastic collapse. For a dynasty that was still relatively new and fragile, every precaution was necessary. A fringe tidbit the witnesses would often bring, their own linens to compare with the ones from the marriage bed to ensure no trickery was afoot. You can almost hear the whispering, "Oh, Lady Anne, is that not the finest damask you've ever seen? Do you think the king? Oh, never mind." It's a surreal blend of high stakes and mundane, almost domestic details. The political maneuvering surrounding this event was intense. Historians still argue whether the stained sheet was always a genuine piece of evidence, or if it was sometimes, let's say, helped along by the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. After all, the pressure on the Queen to produce this evidence was immense. A failed consummation could mean a return to her home country in disgrace, the annulment of her marriage, and the shattering of a political alliance. The stakes were simply too high for some to risk it. A bit of theatrical blood, a carefully placed pinnace, not beyond the realm of possibility. But officially, of course, everything was on the level, witnessed by the most pious and trustworthy members of the court. So, you see, the public witnessing of the consummation was a two-act play. Act 1 was the bedding ceremony, the solemn procession, and the closing of the curtains. Act 2 was the triumphant unveiling of the sheet, the public confirmation of a successful union. It was a performance designed to leave no room for doubt, a piece of political theatre where the most private act was the main event. It's a world that feels so alien to us today, where an act we consider deeply personal was a matter of national security. But for the Tudors, it was just another Tuesday, another step in the relentless quest for power and dynastic survival. The sheet was a trophy, a banner, a testament to a job well done. You can almost hear the distant cheers and sighs of relief echoing through the halls of history. Now that you've seen the bed, you've seen the sheet, let's focus on the faces in the crowd. Who were these witnesses, and what was their role, really? You might imagine a bunch of scandalized gossips peeking through curtains, but the reality was far more mundane and, in its own way, far more chilling. The witnesses were not voyeurs, they were officials. Their presence was a serious, sober duty, a matter of statecraft, not salacious entertainment. The people chosen were almost exclusively high-ranking members of the court, often the most trusted and respected nobles, bishops, and diplomats. Their role was to be objective observers, to provide an official record, to make sure everything was done by the book. The process was formal, almost a legal proceeding. A mainstream historical fact is that these witnesses would often be required to sign a formal document, an affidavit of sorts, attesting to what they had seen. This was then filed away in the royal archives, a final piece of paperwork for the most important political transaction in the kingdom. The witnesses were there to protect the interests of both the crown and the foreign power involved in the marriage. They were the guarantors of the alliance, the human pillars of a new treaty. A funny thought, imagine having to explain that job to a new acquaintance. Oh, me. I'm the official royal consummation witness. I watch the king and queen. Well, you know, it's for the good of the country. It's a job title that would definitely raise some eyebrows at a modern cocktail party. The level of detail they had to observe was, at times, astonishing. You can find historical documents where they describe not just the act, but the condition of the Queen's hair, her demeanor, and the general atmosphere in the room. This was all to create a comprehensive record, a bulletproof case for the legitimacy of the union, a fringe tidbit. There's evidence that in some German courts, the witnesses would literally stand at the foot of the bed with torches to ensure they could see everything clearly. While there's no direct proof of this happening in Tudor England, the sentiment was the same. This was an act of transparency, a way to make the most private of moments public. Historians still argue whether The witness's close proximity was a symbolic gesture or a necessary part of the observation. It's a fascinating debate that gets to the heart of what the Tudors considered proof. Was a stained sheet enough, or did they require human testimony of the act itself? For the king and queen, the presence of the witnesses must have been both a comfort and a terrifying burden. It was a comfort in the sense that it validated their union and protected them from future challenges. It was a burden in the sense that it stripped them of all personal privacy. The king was under immense pressure to perform, to demonstrate his virility for the sake of the kingdom. A failure could lead to whispers of impotence, a catastrophic blow to his image and authority. The queen, on the other hand, was under pressure to prove her virginity and her willingness to be a fertile partner. Her body, her emotions, her very person was on display for the world to see. It was a brutal, dehumanizing experience, but it was all part of the job. So you see, these witnesses weren't just curious onlookers. They were cogs in a larger machine, pieces in a complex puzzle of power and succession. They were the eyes and ears of the state, making sure the most important transaction in the kingdom went off without a hitch. Their solemn faces, their official signatures, and their testimony were as crucial to the survival of the Tudor dynasty as any battle won or any law passed. The bedchamber, once a sanctuary, had become a court of law, and the witnesses were the jury, ready to deliver their verdict. Now let's shift our perspective to the king himself. You're standing in his shoes, a powerful monarch whose word is law, whose very presence commands respect. But in this moment, you are uniquely vulnerable. The consummation ceremony, far from being a private, joyous occasion, was a performance with the highest of stakes, and the pressure on the king to perform was immense. His virility wasn't just a personal attribute, it was a matter of national security, a crucial factor in maintaining the stability of the realm. A king who couldn't produce an heir was a king whose dynasty was in jeopardy. Imagine the psychological burden. You have a room full of the most powerful people in the country and a foreign ambassador or two, all waiting for you to complete the act, the fate of your kingdom, a political alliance with another nation, and the very legitimacy of your future children all hang on this one moment. You can't just say, "I'm not in the mood," or "this is a bit awkward." Your body is now a piece of state machinery, and it has a job to do. This pressure could be paralyzing, and it made the king's vulnerability a very real and tangible thing. A mainstream historical fact is that this immense pressure was a significant factor in cases of unconsummated marriages, such as the one between Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, and King Louis XII of France. The older king was so frail and exhausted from the wedding celebrations that he was unable to consummate the marriage, and he died just a few months later. Adding to the tension was the fact that a king's perceived potency was directly linked to his political power. A king who was seen as strong and virile was seen as a strong and effective ruler. A king who was perceived as weak or impotent was a target for his enemies, both at home and abroad. A fringe tidbit. There's a historical account of a Tudor courtier who wrote in his diary that he felt a great sense of relief after the consummation was confirmed, not just for the queen, but for the king, whose manhood was thus proven to all. This shows just how intertwined a king's private life was with his public persona. Historians still argue whether the pressure to perform led to a higher incidence of impotence among royal husbands, or if these cases were simply more documented due to their political significance. It's a fascinating look at the intersection of psychology, politics, and power. The entire ritual was designed to turn the king's vulnerability into a strength. By publicly proving his ability to consummate the marriage, he was also publicly affirming his power and his right to rule. The witnesses weren't just there to see the act. They were there to see him succeed. Their presence was a form of political insurance, a way to make sure that no one could later challenge his fitness to rule. But for that insurance to be valid, he had to go through a trial by fire, a deeply personal ordeal that was also a matter of state. So, you're in the king's shoes, feeling the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders. You've been dressed in your finest nightclothes, served your caudle, and tucked into bed by a procession of the most important people in the land. The curtains are drawn, but you know they're still out there, waiting. You're not just a man trying to be intimate with his new wife. You're a symbol, a king, a living embodiment of your dynasty's future. It's a night of hope and terror, a strange blend of duty and desire. And for a Tudor monarch, there was no escaping the public. Not even in the marriage bed. While the king's vulnerability was a matter of state, the queen's experience was a different kind of trial altogether. You are now in her shoes, a young bride, often just a teenager, plucked from your homeland and married to a powerful king you may have never met before. For a Tudor queen, the wedding night wasn't a romantic beginning. It was an ordeal filled with quiet terror and profound vulnerability. You are a princess, a pawn in a Game of Thrones, and your body is the ultimate bargaining chip. Imagine the emotional weight of it all. You are in a strange country, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, speaking a different language. Your family is thousands of miles away, and on this most private of nights, you are stripped of all privacy. The bedding ceremony, with its boisterous songs and public toasting, must have felt less like a celebration and more like a public inspection. The king's attendants are there, but so are yours, your ladies in waiting, the only familiar faces in a sea of strangers. They are there to prepare you, to calm you, and to witness your part in this bizarre ritual. Their presence is a small comfort, a reminder of the home you have left behind. The pressure on the Queen was immense. A mainstream historical fact is that she was expected to prove her virginity and her fertility. Her value as a political asset was directly tied to her ability to produce a male heir. A queen who couldn't, or wouldn't, perform her duty was a failure in the eyes of her family, her husband, and her new country. The silence after the witnesses left must have been deafening, filled with the weight of expectation. For a young woman who had been raised to be chaste and pious, the sudden requirement to be a sexual object for the state must have been a terrifying and disorienting experience. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a German noblewoman who was so terrified on her wedding night that her ladies-in-waiting had to administer a dose of opium to calm her nerves. A testament to the sheer psychological stress of the event. Historians still argue whether the Queen's consent was a factor at all in this situation. Was it a ritual of violence, or was it simply a fulfillment of her duty? The reality is likely somewhere in between. She was a royal, and as such, her life was not her own. Her purpose was to serve her country and her dynasty, and this was the most important part of that service. The bedding ceremony, the waiting witnesses, and the presentation of the sheet were all part of her journey, from princess to queen, from girl to matron. It was a baptism by fire, a ritual that stripped her of her innocence and transformed her into a political symbol. The king's role was to perform, but the queen's role was to endure. She had to be present, to be willing, and to, in her own way, cooperate with this strange ritual. A successful consummation was a relief for her, as much as it was for the king. It meant she had done her duty, that the alliance was secure, and that her future was, at least for the moment, safe. But the quiet terror of that night would stay with her forever, a memory of a time when her body was not her own, but a piece of state property on display for all to see. You can feel her vulnerability, her quiet dignity, and her profound isolation in that grand, heavy bed. The witnesses, you recall, weren't just any old courtiers. Among them were often bishops and other high-ranking clergy, men of God who were tasked with overseeing a very secular and very carnal act. You might find this a strange paradox, but, for the Tudors, it made perfect sense. The Church's involvement was crucial, as it provided a theological justification for a practice that was, on the surface, quite unseemly. A mainstream historical fact is that the Catholic Church, and later the Church of England, held that a marriage was only valid and indissoluble once it had been physically consummated. The act of consummation was what transformed a legal contract into a sacred bond, an act of God. The Church's stance was clear. A marriage was a union of two souls and two bodies. The legal ceremony in the Church was just the first step. The consummation was the second, and arguably more important, step. The presence of the bishops and other clergy was meant to sanctify the event, to imbue it with a sense of religious purpose. They weren't just witnesses, they were spiritual guarantors. Their job was to ensure that the couple had truly become one flesh in the eyes of God and the law. This added a layer of solemnity to the entire affair, transforming a bizarre political ritual into a quasi-religious rite. Historians still argue whether the Church's involvement was a genuine expression of faith or a cynical use of religion to legitimize political power. It's a fascinating question that gets to the heart of the relationship between church and state in Tudor England. The bishop's presence also served another purpose. It made it much harder to later annul the marriage. If a marriage was consummated in the presence of a bishop and a record was made, it was very difficult for a king to later claim that the marriage was invalid. This was a double-edged sword for the king. On the one hand, it secured his dynasty and his alliance. On the other hand, it made it very difficult for him to escape a marriage that had gone sour. A fringe tidbit. There's a historical record of a bishop who, after witnessing a consummation, wrote a detailed letter to the Pope, describing not only the act but also his own feelings of being overwhelmed by the awesome power of God's plan. This shows that for some, the ritual was a genuinely spiritual experience. The bishop's role was particularly important in cases where the marriage was being challenged. The annulment of a marriage, a major political event in Tudor England, often hinged on the question of whether or not the marriage had been consummated. The testimony of a bishop or a priest was much more reliable than that of a courtier or a diplomat. Their word was seen as having a divine weight, a truth that could not be denied. So, when you see a bishop in the royal bedchamber, don't just see a religious leader. See a legal expert, a political operator, and a spiritual guarantor, all rolled into one. You're standing in the shoes of that bishop, a man of God in a secular world, tasked with a bizarre and uncomfortable duty. You are there to bless the union, to witness its physical completion, and to provide a record of it for both God and the state. You are a crucial piece of the Tudor machine, a cog in the wheel of power, and your presence is a testament to the strange and wonderful ways that religion and politics intertwined in this fascinating period of history. The scene is set, the players are in place, but what did it actually look like to a contemporary observer? You're now a fly on the wall, not just a historical ghost, but a real-time spectator. The best glimpse we have into this bizarre world comes from the detailed accounts of foreign ambassadors, men whose job it was to report every detail of the English court back to their home monarchs. A mainstream historical fact is that these diplomats' dispatches are some of our most valuable sources of information about the Tudor court, as they were often more candid and less censored than the official chronicles. One such account, a truly fascinating historical source, comes from the Spanish ambassador, who was tasked with observing the consummation of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon's marriage. He was there to ensure that the Spanish princess was being treated properly and that the marriage was valid in the eyes of both England and Spain. His account is a masterpiece of diplomatic restraint and subtle gossip. He describes the elaborate bedding ceremony, the festive atmosphere, and the solemn procession of courtiers. He mentions the king and queen being served caudle, a warm, spiced drink, and being tucked into bed by their attendants. A fringe tidbit from his account. He notes that the king, Prince Arthur, looked a little pale and nervous, a small detail that gives a powerful sense of the immense pressure on the young prince. Historians still argue about the exact wording of his report. Did he say he saw the consummation, or did he say he believed it happened? The language is often diplomatic and vague, designed to convey the truth without explicitly stating it. For example, he might say that the marriage was successfully completed or that the act was performed to the satisfaction of the witnesses, which leaves some room for interpretation. This ambiguity is what makes these documents so fascinating and so difficult to interpret. We have to read between the lines to understand the political context of every word. The ambassador's report was not just a historical document, it was a political tool. It was sent back to Spain to be used as evidence that the alliance with England was secure. A positive report meant that the treaty was solid, the princess was safe, and the future of the alliance was bright. A negative report, on the other hand, could have led to a political crisis, a diplomatic incident, and even war. The ambassador's pen was as powerful as any sword. He was writing not for history, but for the immediate political future of two nations. He was the ultimate witness, a man whose testimony could literally change the course of history. You can feel the weight of his responsibility as you read his words. He is a careful observer, a man who knows that every detail matters. He notes the color of the bedsheets, the demeanor of the courtiers, and the smallest changes in the king's and queen's behavior. He is a spy, a diplomat, and a historian, all in one. His report is a window into a world that is at once alien and familiar, a world where the most private moments were matters of public record. So, as you stand there, a silent observer in the Tudor court, you are not alone. The ambassador is there. With you, a fellow witness to this strange and wonderful piece of history. Not every royal consummation was a success. You've heard about the pressure, the public witnessing, and the political stakes. But what happened when it all went wrong? An unconsummated union was a political catastrophe, and its aftermath could be devastating. A mainstream historical fact is that a marriage that was never physically completed could be annulled by the church, effectively making it as if it had never happened. This was a king's worst nightmare, as it could throw the succession into chaos and destabilize the entire kingdom. The most famous case of an unconsummated union, of course, is that of Henry VIII and Anne of Cleves. The story, as told by Henry himself, is that he found her physically unappealing and was unable to perform his kingly duty. He claimed that despite their sleeping together every night for several months, the marriage was never consummated. The political fallout was immediate. Anne's brother, the Duke of Cleves, was a powerful ally against the Holy Roman Emperor, and the marriage was supposed to cement this alliance. Henry's decision to seek an annulment shattered this alliance and left him politically isolated. The fact that the marriage was unconsummated was the legal grounds for the annulment. Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had arranged the marriage, was blamed for the disaster and subsequently executed. A fringe tidbit: there's an account of one of Henry's courtiers describing the king's frustration and embarrassment over his inability to consummate the marriage, and even mentioning that the king was so upset that he would often spend the evenings alone, sulking and drinking. This gives a powerful sense of the personal toll this political and physical failure had on the king. Historians still argue whether Henry's claims were genuine or if they were simply a convenient excuse to get out of a politically inconvenient marriage. It's a fascinating debate that gets to the heart of Henry's character and his relationship with his wives. Was he a man who was genuinely repulsed by Anne, or was he a political opportunist who used the excuse of an unconsummated marriage to get what he wanted? The historical evidence is mixed, but the outcome was the same. The annulment was granted. The alliance was broken, and Thomas Cromwell lost his head. It's a powerful example of how the most intimate of acts could have the most profound political consequences. The process of annulling a marriage was a long and complicated one. It required the testimony of the king, the queen, and the witnesses. In the case of Henry and Anne, the witnesses were asked to testify about what they had observed, or in this case, not observed. The Queen Anne of Cleves was surprisingly cooperative, as she knew that fighting the annulment would likely lead to her execution. She testified that the marriage had never been consummated, and she was rewarded with a generous pension and the title of the king's beloved sister. For a queen who had a very short and unhappy reign, this was a surprisingly good outcome. So, you see, the spectre of an unconsummated union haunted every royal marriage. It was a failure of the body, but it was also a failure of the state. It was a powerful reminder that a king's power was not just in his sword, but in his ability to produce an heir. An unconsummated marriage was a public admission of weakness, a vulnerability that could be exploited by political enemies. It was a nightmare scenario, a political and personal disaster that every king and queen hoped to avoid. And in the case of Henry and Anne, it led to the fall of a powerful minister and a shift in the political landscape of Europe. The public spectacle of a royal consummation was a bizarre blend of statecraft and bedroom farce. But for the king and queen, the public display was in stark contrast to their private pain. You're now inside the minds of the royal couple, experiencing the emotional and psychological toll of this ritual. It's easy to look at this from a distance and see it as a funny, historical quirk. But for the people involved, it was anything but. Imagine being the young queen, newly married and thrust into a foreign court. You've been raised to be chaste and pious, and suddenly you are the center of a public ritual of a very physical nature. A mainstream historical fact is that many royal brides, like Catherine of Aragon, were just teenagers when they were married. The quiet terror of that night must have been immense. Your body is not your own. It belongs to the state, to the alliance, to the future of a dynasty. Your private life is a public record, and your most intimate moments are a matter of national security. The public display of the bedding ceremony, with its bawdy songs and toasts, was meant to be a celebration, but for the Queen it was more. Likely a terrifying countdown to a moment of profound vulnerability. For the King, The pressure was of a different kind. A powerful monarch, used to getting his way, he was now at the mercy of his own body. His virility was a public matter, and a failure to perform would be a public humiliation. The public display of a successful consummation was a triumph, a confirmation of his power and his right to rule. But the private pain of the pressure, the anxiety, and the fear of failure must have been immense. A fringe tidbit: there's a historical account of a king who, after a successful consummation, was so relieved that he wept openly, a testament to the emotional toll of the experience. It's difficult for us to fully comprehend this mindset. The idea of a separation between public and private life is a modern one. For the Tudors, there was no such distinction. The king's body was the body of the state. His health, his virility, and his ability to produce an heir were all matters of public concern. His private life was a public record, and his bedchamber was an extension of his throne room. The public display was a necessary evil, a way to ensure that the private act was not just an act of passion, but an act of state. The private pain was the price they paid for the public security of their dynasty. The public display was a moment of political triumph, a confirmation of a new alliance and a new heir. But the private pain was a memory that would last a lifetime. The king and queen were two people, alone in a room, with the weight of an entire kingdom on their shoulders. They were symbols, yes, but they were also human beings with their own fears, anxieties, and desires. The public display and the private pain were two sides of the same coin, two parts of a ritual that was both bizarre and profoundly human. You can feel the tension in the room, the public celebration and the private dread, a strange and powerful mix of emotions that defined the Tudor experience. The public witnessing of a royal consummation wasn't an invention of the Tudors. You might be surprised to learn that this bizarre custom had its origins on the continent. The Tudors, in many ways, were late adopters of a practice that had been a staple of German nobility for centuries. This historical context is crucial to understanding why the Tudors embraced it with such fervor. For a new dynasty, a practice with a long-standing European precedent lent a sense of legitimacy and tradition to their own nascent power. The German precedent was particularly influential. A mainstream historical fact is that in many German principalities, the consummation was a public, verifiable event. The German princes, much like the Tudors, were deeply concerned with the legitimacy of their heirs and the stability of their alliances. They used the public witnessing of the consummation as a way to formalize a marriage and prevent future disputes over succession. The practice was so ingrained in German culture that it was seen as a standard part of a royal wedding. The Tudors, always keen to prove their own royal bona fides, saw this as a useful tool. They adopted it, refined it, and made it their own, turning a continental custom into a distinctively Tudor one. A fringe tidbit is that in some German courts, the witnesses would not only watch the consummation, but also taste the caudle, the fertility drink, to ensure it wasn't poisoned. This adds another layer of paranoia and political intrigue to an already bizarre ritual. The caudle was seen as a crucial part of the ceremony, and its safety was a matter of state. For the Tudors, this detail was likely a bit too much, but the underlying sentiment that every aspect of the marriage had to be verifiable and safe was the same. The German precedent gave the Tudors a framework, a set of rules, and a sense of tradition to follow. The adoption of this practice also shows how interconnected the European royal families were. A royal marriage was never just a local affair. It was a European-wide event, and the customs and traditions of one court would often influence another. The Tudors were not a closed-off island nation. They were a part of a larger European royal family, and they were keenly aware of how their actions were perceived by their peers on the continent, adopting a practice that was common among German nobility was a way to show that they were a legitimate, powerful, and respected dynasty. It was a form of political signaling, a way to say, we are just as royal as you are. The German precedent gave the Tudors a way to turn a private act into a public statement. It gave them a language, a set of symbols, and a ritual to use in their quest for power and dynastic survival. The bed, the sheet, the witnesses, and the caudle were all parts of a larger narrative that was being told across Europe. The Tudors simply took that narrative and made it their own, adding their own unique blend of drama, paranoia, and political savvy. The public witnessing of the Consummation was not just a bizarre ritual. It was a sign of the times, a testament to the interconnectedness of the European royal families and the relentless quest for power and legitimacy that defined the age. You have to remember, the Tudors were a new dynasty. Henry VII, the founder, had seized the throne in battle, and his claim was, to put it mildly, a little shaky. For him, every action, every ceremony, had to be carefully orchestrated to solidify his family's place on the throne. The public witnessing of the Consummation was a crucial tool in his arsenal, a masterstroke of political prudence. He understood that legitimacy wasn't just inherited. It had to be performed, proven, and witnessed. Henry VII's prudence was on full display in his approach to his son's marriage. A mainstream historical fact is that he orchestrated the marriage of his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. This marriage was a cornerstone of his foreign policy, a way to secure an alliance with one of the most powerful nations in Europe. For this alliance to be truly solid, the marriage had to be consummated, and everyone had to know it. Henry VII wasn't going to leave anything to chance. He made sure that the consummation was witnessed and that a formal record was made, leaving no room for future doubt. His foresight was remarkable. He was building a dynasty from the ground up, and he knew that the foundation had to be solid. He understood that a rumor, a whisper, or a simple lack of evidence could bring down his entire house. By publicly witnessing the consummation, he was creating a bulletproof case for his son's legitimacy and for the future of the Tudor line. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of Henry VII personally inspecting the bedchamber and the witnesses before the ceremony, a testament to his meticulous nature and his deep-seated paranoia about the security of his dynasty. He was not just a king. He was the CEO of a new company, and he was making sure every single detail of the IPO was perfect. His prudence was also a sign of his deep-seated anxiety. He had won the throne, but he was always worried about losing it. He had a lot of enemies, and he knew they would use any weakness, any hint of a scandal, to try and bring him down. The public witnessing of the consummation was a way to neutralize that threat before it even began. It was a show of strength, a performance of power, and a declaration to the world that the Tudor dynasty was here to stay. He was a master of political theatre, and the consummation ceremony was one of his greatest hits. So, as you reflect on this bizarre ritual, remember its purpose. It was not a sign of depravity or voyeurism. It was a sign of prudence, of a king who was building a dynasty from the ground up and who was willing to do whatever it took to secure his family's place in history. Henry VII was a king who understood that in the Game of Thrones, you don't just win the battle, you win the narrative. And the public witnessing of the consummation was a crucial part of that narrative, a powerful piece of evidence that his dynasty was legitimate, powerful, and here to stay. The consummation of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon's marriage in 1501 stands as the most infamous example of this bizarre ritual, a moment in history that would have profound and lasting consequences. You're now a silent observer in this grand, historical drama, watching as a young prince and princess are united in a marriage that would eventually lead to the greatest schism in English history. The marriage itself was a massive political event. A mainstream historical fact is that Arthur, the heir to the Tudor throne, was just 15, and Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of the Spanish monarchs, was 16. The ceremony was a lavish affair, with feasts, jousts, and pageants. But the real main event, the one that everyone was really waiting for, was the consummation. The public bedding ceremony was performed with all the usual pomp and circumstance. The couple was led to the marriage bed by their attendants, the caudle was served, and the witnesses were in attendance. The hope was that this would be a triumphant moment, the beginning of a long and prosperous reign for the Tudor dynasty. The day after, the proof was presented. The Spanish ambassador, with diplomatic aplomb, reported back to his sovereigns that the marriage had been successfully consummated. The sheets were shown, the witnesses signed their affidavits, and the world rejoiced, or so it seemed, a fringe tidbit. There's a historical account of Prince Arthur, the morning after, boasting to his attendants that he had been to Spain and back, a light-hearted comment that was meant to convey his success in the marriage bed. This shows that the young prince was keenly aware of the pressure on him and was eager to show that he had fulfilled his duty. This offhand remark would later be used against his widow, Catherine, a cruel irony of history. The problem, of course, was that Prince Arthur was not in the best of health. He was a frail and sickly young man, and within a few months of the marriage, he was dead. His death left a massive political vacuum and a serious problem. The question was Catherine a virgin? The Spanish claimed she was, and that the marriage had never been fully consummated. The English and Henry VII claimed this was not a minor detail. This was the question that would eventually lead to the English Reformation. The ambiguity of the consummation was the perfect storm. The Spanish needed a way to get their daughter back, and the English needed a way to keep her and her dowry. So, a compromise was reached. Catherine was married to Arthur's younger brother, Henry VIII, a marriage that would, for a time, secure the alliance. The Pope granted a special dispensation, a rare and controversial act, allowing Henry to marry his brother's widow. This was all based on the premise that the marriage to Arthur was never consummated. This would, of course, come back to haunt Henry VIII in a spectacular and bloody way. You can feel the tension building, the historical currents converging, all because of a single ambiguous event in a royal bedchamber. The question of Catherine of Aragon's virginity is one of the most hotly debated topics in all of Tudor history. You have to understand that this wasn't just a matter of gossip or historical curiosity. This was a matter of life and death, of political alliances, and of the very future of the English Church. The public witnessing of the consummation of her marriage to Prince Arthur was supposed to settle this question once and for all. But as you know, it did anything but. The Spanish claimed that Catherine was a virgin when she married Henry VIII, and the English, for a time, agreed with them. A mainstream historical fact is that the Pope granted a special dispensation for Henry to marry his brother's widow. But this was only on the condition that the marriage to Arthur was never consummated. This was a massive legal loophole, one that Henry would later use to his great advantage. But for the time, everyone was happy. The alliance was secure, and a new Tudor prince had a wife. The problem was that the evidence was at best ambiguous. The historical records from the time are a fascinating mix of testimony, rumor, and outright propaganda. A fringe tidbit. There's an account from a Spanish diplomat who wrote that the young Catherine was so afraid of the consummation that she begged her ladies-in-waiting to help her fake it. This, of course, is a rumor, but it gives a powerful sense of the pressure on the young princess. The problem was that both sides had a vested interest in the outcome. The Spanish needed their daughter to be a virgin so that she could marry the new king, Henry VIII. The English needed her to be a virgin so that they could keep the massive dowry that came with her. Everyone was playing a game of historical revisionism, a game that would eventually backfire in a spectacular way. The question of Catherine's virginity was a time bomb, ticking away in the heart of the Tudor court. For a time, it was buried under layers of political convenience and diplomatic politesse. But as Henry VIII grew older and his desire for a male heir grew more desperate, he began to revisit the question. He started to believe that his lack of a male heir was a sign of God's displeasure, a punishment for his sin of marrying his brother's widow. He began to question the Pope's original dispensation, arguing that it was invalid because the marriage to Arthur had, in fact, been consummated. He even went so far as to claim that a line in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, forbade a man from marrying his brother's wife. This was a classic case of historical revisionism, a powerful king using his own version of history to get what he wanted. The question of Catherine's virginity was no longer a matter of historical fact. It was a matter of political power, a weapon to be used in Henry's quest for an annulment. The once private act of a young prince and princess in a royal bedchamber was now at the center of a political and religious firestorm, a fire that would eventually consume the entire English church. The very fabric of the kingdom was being torn apart, all because of an ambiguous event that had happened decades ago. Henry VIII's desperation for a male heir would eventually consume him and his kingdom. You're now a witness to this historical unraveling, watching a powerful king lose his mind and his soul in a frantic attempt to prove his marriage to Catherine of Aragon was invalid. This wasn't just a matter of a king wanting a new wife. This was a matter of a king wanting a son to secure his dynasty and prevent the chaos of a succession crisis. His actions, driven by this desperation, would change the course of English history forever. His initial argument was based on a single line in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, which stated that if a man married his brother's wife, they would be childless. A mainstream historical fact is that Henry VIII, in his desperation, became convinced that his lack of a male heir was God's punishment for his sin. He believed that the marriage was invalid from the start, a sin in the eyes of God, and that the Pope's dispensation to allow him to marry Catherine was therefore invalid. This was his legal and moral justification for seeking an annulment. But the Pope, caught between a rock and a hard place, Henry VIII and Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was unwilling to grant it. This led Henry down a path of increasing desperation and paranoia. He began to question everything about his marriage to Catherine, including the consummation of her first marriage to his brother Arthur. He demanded that all the original witnesses, if they were still alive, be brought before him to testify. He also demanded that Catherine herself testify about the nature of her first marriage. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of one of Henry's courtiers describing the king's frantic late-night meetings with his advisors, where he would pace back and forth, holding a copy of the Bible and a legal document, his eyes wild with desperation. He was a man obsessed, a king on the verge of a breakdown. His desperation also led him to a stunning act of political and religious courage, or madness, depending on your point of view. He decided to break with the Pope and declare himself the head of the Church of England. This was his final, desperate gambit. By doing so, he could grant himself his own annulment and marry Anne Boleyn, the woman he believed would give him a son. It was a massive gamble, a move that would tear the kingdom apart and lead to decades of religious strife. Henry VIII's frantic attempts to prove his marriage to Catherine, invalid, were a powerful reminder of how a king's private desires could have the most profound public consequences. The once private act of a young prince and princess in a royal bedchamber was now at the center of a political and religious firestorm. The kingdom was being torn apart, all because of a single, ambiguous event that had happened decades ago. Henry's desperation, his paranoia, and his obsession with a male heir would lead to the English Reformation, a moment in history that would change the world forever. The annulment of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a political earthquake that sent shockwaves throughout Europe. You're now witnessing the aftermath, a world torn apart by a king's desperation for a son. The annulment was a masterclass in political maneuvering, a brutal and ruthless exercise of power that would lead to a complete overhaul of the English, religious and political landscape. The annulment itself was a massive undertaking. Henry, having broken with the Pope, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England. He then appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, who promptly granted him the annulment he so desperately wanted. This act was not just a legal formality. It was a schism, a break with 1,000 years of Catholic tradition. A mainstream historical fact is that this act, known as the English Reformation, was a direct result of Henry's desire for a male heir. It wasn't a theological dispute at first, it was a political one. It was all about the king's great matter, his marriage. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Those who refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the new church were executed. The most famous example, of course, is Sir Thomas More, a brilliant lawyer and former Lord Chancellor, who refused to swear the oath of supremacy and was beheaded for treason. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of one of Henry's courtiers describing the king's strange mix of elation and despair after the annulment was granted. He was happy to have gotten his way, but he was also deeply troubled by the scale of the schism he had caused. He had broken with his faith, his queen, and his most trusted advisors, all for the sake of a son. The annulment's aftermath was a period of immense religious and political turmoil. The monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized by the crown. The Catholic saints were removed from the churches. The entire religious landscape of England was transformed, all because of an ambiguous event that had happened decades ago. The question of whether Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon had consummated their marriage was no longer a matter of historical curiosity. It was a matter of life and death, of salvation and damnation. The political and religious schisms that resulted from the Consummation debate would last for centuries, leading to the bloody reigns of his children, Mary I and Elizabeth I. The annulment's aftermath was a powerful reminder of how a king's private desires could have the most profound public consequences. The once private act of a young prince and princess in a royal bedchamber was now at the center of a political and religious firestorm. The kingdom was being torn apart, all because of a single, ambiguous event that had happened decades ago. Henry's desperation, his paranoia, and his obsession with a male heir would lead to the English Reformation, a moment in history that would change the world forever. With his marriage to Catherine annulled and his new church established, Henry VIII's later marriages took on a very different character. You're now watching as the public spectacle of the consummation gives way to something more private, more hurried, and in some ways more unsettling. The most striking example of this shift is his marriage to his third wife, Jane Seymour. Unlike his first two marriages, which were massive public events, Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour was a quiet, almost secret affair. A mainstream historical fact is that they were married just 11 days after Anne Boleyn was executed. There was no grand public wedding, no elaborate feasts, and certainly no public bedding ceremony. The urgency and secrecy of the marriage were a stark contrast to the pomp and circumstance of his earlier unions. This was not a king who was trying to prove a point to the world. This was a king who was desperate for a son and was willing to do anything to get one. The lack of a public consummation ceremony for this marriage is telling. After the chaos and drama of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry was likely in no mood for another public spectacle. He had learned the hard way that a public consummation could be a double-edged sword. It could be used to prove a marriage was valid, but it could also be used to challenge it. By keeping the consummation of his marriage to Jane Seymour private, he was trying to avoid any future legal or political challenges. This was a king who had become a master of historical revisionism, and he was not going to let his past mistakes haunt him again. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of one of Henry's courtiers describing the king's strange mix of relief and anxiety on his wedding night with Jane. He was relieved to be free of Anne Boleyn and her failure to produce a male heir, but he was also anxious about his new wife's ability to do so. The quiet wedding was a reflection of the quiet anxiety that now haunted the king. The shift away from public consummation was also a sign of a new, more absolute form of kingship. Henry VIII, having broken with the Pope and declared himself the head of the Church, no longer needed the Church's blessing or the public's validation for his marriages. His word was law, and his marriages were valid simply because he said they were. The public witnessing of the consummation was a custom from a time when a king's power was more constrained, when he had to rely on the support of the Church and the nobility to legitimize his actions. With his new, absolute power, Henry no longer needed to play by those rules. So you see, the quiet wedding of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour was not just a historical footnote. It was a sign of a new era, a time when a king's private desires were not just a matter of public concern, but a matter of state. The public witnessing of the consummation was a custom that had served its purpose. With the English Reformation, it was no longer needed. The king's body was now the supreme authority, and his private actions were no longer subject to public scrutiny. With the death of Henry VIII and the succession of his young son, Edward VI, the public witnessing of the consummation was rendered completely irrelevant. You are now in a new era, a time of a boy king, a time of regents, and a time of a different kind of anxiety. Edward VI was just 9 years old when he took the throne, and his reign would be dominated by the struggle for power among his regents. The idea of a public consummation for a king who was not even a man was absurd. The absence of any talk of a consummation ceremony during Edward VI's reign is telling. A mainstream historical fact is that Edward's advisors and regents were more concerned with consolidating their own power and advancing the Protestant Reformation than they were with the king's marital status. His marriage was a distant, future concern, something that would only become an issue when he came of age. The public witnessing of the consummation was a ritual of a bygone era, a relic of a time when the king's virility was a matter of national security. With a child on the throne, the focus shifted from the king's body to the king's mind and his soul. The historical documents from this period are filled with talk of religious reform, political intrigue, and the struggle for power. Among the regents, there is no mention of a public consummation, no discussion of the king's marital prospects, and no anxiety about the future of the dynasty. The urgency of Henry VIII's reign was gone, replaced by a kind of holding pattern. The Tudors, for a time, were without a head, and the kingdom was run by a committee. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of one of Edward's tutors writing in his diary that the young king was more interested in theological debates than he was in jousting or hunting, a testament to his deeply religious nature and his complete disinterest in the traditional pursuits of a Tudor monarch. He was a king of the mind, not of the body, and the public consummation was a ritual of the body. The lack of consummation witnessing during Edward VI's reign also shows how fragile a custom it was. It was a practice that was only necessary when there was a question of legitimacy or succession. With a young male king on the throne, there was no question. The succession was clear, at least for the moment. The anxiety about a lack of an heir was replaced by a different kind of anxiety, the anxiety of a regency, of a kingdom run by powerful, ambitious men who were all vying for control. The focus of the kingdom shifted from the bedchamber to the council chamber, and the public witnessing of the consummation was left behind, a relic of a more dramatic and more dangerous time. So, you see, the story of the public consummation isn't just a story about sex and power. It's a story about the evolution of the Tudor dynasty, from a new and fragile power to a more established and secure one. It's a story about the changing nature of kingship, from a physical and personal one to a more spiritual and political one. The absence of the public consummation during Edward VI's reign is just as important as its presence during his father's. It tells us that the Tudors had, for a time, moved on from their obsession with a male heir and their fear of a succession crisis. The brief reign of Mary I, the first Tudor queen, brought back some of the anxieties and customs of her father's time, but with a new twist. You're now in a kingdom ruled by a woman, and the political and religious landscape has shifted dramatically. The public witnessing of the consummation was still a thing, but its purpose was no longer about a king's virility or the legitimacy of his children. It was now about a queen's fertility and the political necessity of a male heir. Mary I's marriage to Philip of Spain was a political match of the highest order. A mainstream historical fact is that it was a deeply unpopular marriage, as the English feared being dominated by Spain. But for Mary, a devout Catholic, it was a way to return England to the Catholic faith and secure a powerful ally. For this alliance to work, and for Mary to secure the future of her dynasty, she had to produce a male heir. The public witnessing of the consummation of her marriage to Philip was a crucial part of this political drama. It was a way to show the English people that the marriage was real and that a new Catholic heir was on the way. The pressure on Mary was immense. At 38, she was considered to be past childbearing age by Tudor standards, and her desire for a child was both personal and political. The public consummation was a sign of hope, a promise that the Catholic faith would be secured in England for generations to come. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Spanish diplomat who wrote that the English courtiers, while deeply suspicious of Philip, were nevertheless hopeful that the consummation would be successful, as it would mean the end of the religious strife that had plagued the kingdom for decades. The entire kingdom was holding its breath, hoping for a miracle. The consummation of Mary's marriage to Philip was a political statement, a declaration to the world that England was once again a Catholic nation and that its future was tied to Spain. The public witnessing of the consummation was a way to make that statement official. The witnesses, both English and Spanish, were there to attest to the validity of the marriage and to the hope of a new heir. But as you know, that hope was never realized. Mary had 2 phantom pregnancies and died childless, and the kingdom was plunged back into a succession crisis. The public consummation, in this case, was a symbol of hope that ultimately failed. The consummation of Mary's marriage to Philip shows how the purpose of the ritual had evolved. It was no longer about a king's virility or a new dynasty's legitimacy. It was now about a queen's fertility and a kingdom's religious future. The bedchamber was still a stage, but the players and the stakes were different. The public witnessing of the consummation was a ritual of hope, a desperate gamble for a queen who was running out of time and a kingdom that was on the brink of another succession crisis. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a time when a queen's body was a matter of state, just as her father's had been. With the accession of Elizabeth I, the public witnessing of the consummation was rendered completely moot, a relic of a bygone era. You were now in the reign of the Virgin Queen, a monarch who would famously refuse to marry, and in doing so would turn the entire concept of a royal marriage and its consummation on its head. Her decision to remain unmarried was a powerful and deliberate political statement, a rejection of the traditional role of a Tudor monarch. Elizabeth I's status as the Virgin Queen was a political masterstroke. A mainstream historical fact is that she used her unmarried status as a way to maintain political independence. She could dangle the possibility of marriage to various European princes, keeping them on the hook and preventing them from forming alliances against her. Her refusal to marry was a rejection of the idea that a queen's primary duty was to produce a male heir. She famously declared that she was married to her kingdom and that her subjects were her children. This was a radical and unprecedented move, and it completely changed the way her subjects and her rivals viewed her. The lack of a consummation ceremony during her reign is just as important as its presence during her father's. It tells us that the Tudor dynasty had, for a time, moved on from its obsession with a male heir and its fear of a succession crisis. The anxiety about a lack of an heir was replaced by a different kind of anxiety, the anxiety of a kingdom without a direct successor. But Elizabeth, a master of political theatre, was able to turn this anxiety into a strength. She used her unmarried status to project an image of strength and independence, a queen who was beholden to no one but her kingdom. A fringe tidbit: there's a historical account of a Spanish ambassador who, in a dispatch back to his king, wrote that Elizabeth's refusal to marry was a woman's trick, a clever piece of diplomatic maneuvering that was both frustrating and impressive. He and her other rivals simply could not comprehend a queen who would not use her body as a political tool. Her decision to remain a virgin also had a profound impact on her legacy. She was seen as a queen who was above the petty politics of marriage and the messy business of a consummation. She was a symbol of purity and strength, a monarch who was not just a ruler, but a myth. The public witnessing of the consummation was a ritual of the body, a ritual that was completely incompatible with the image of the Virgin Queen. She was a king of the mind, not of the body, and her reign was a testament to the power of a single woman to defy the expectations of an entire era. So you see, the story of the public consummation ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. It was a ritual of a time that was defined by a fear of a succession crisis, a fear that was completely irrelevant during the reign of a queen who was married to her kingdom. The public witnessing of the consummation was a custom that had served its purpose. With the ascension of Elizabeth I, it was no longer needed. The Queen's body was now a symbol of her kingdom, and her private actions were no longer subject to public scrutiny. She was a queen who had finally broken free from the cage of her gender and the expectations of her time. Now that we've charted the rise and fall of this bizarre custom, let's get back to the faces in the room. You're no longer a historical ghost. You are a courtier, one of the privileged few chosen to be a witness. What was your duty, really? It was more than just standing around and watching. It was a deeply symbolic and highly specific role that came with a great deal of responsibility and, in some cases, a little bit of danger. Your duty was, first and foremost, to be a reliable and trustworthy observer. A mainstream historical fact is that the witnesses were often the most powerful and influential people in the court, often high-ranking nobles, bishops, and diplomats. Their social standing gave their testimony weight, making it difficult for anyone to later dispute their claims. You were there to protect the interests of both the crown and the foreign power involved in the marriage. You were the human guarantor of the alliance, the living pillars of a new treaty. Your duty was to observe, to record, and to sign an affidavit attesting to the consummation. It was a serious, sober, and sometimes terrifying responsibility. The specific duties of the witnesses could also be quite detailed. You might be tasked with bringing the king and queen to the marriage bed, helping them to undress, and serving them the caudle. You might also be tasked with ensuring that no one else was in the room, that the bed was properly prepared, and that the sheet was pristine. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a witness who was tasked with ensuring that the king was not wearing a magical amulet that could prevent the consummation. The belief in witchcraft and magic was still strong in Tudor England, and the witnesses were tasked with ensuring that everything was done by the book, and by the rules of both God and man. Your duty also extended to the morning after. You would be one of the first people to enter the room, and you would be tasked with inspecting the sheet and, in some cases, the Queen herself. This was a particularly delicate and uncomfortable duty, but it was a crucial part of the ritual. Your testimony, your signature, and your word were the final piece of the puzzle, the last and most important part of the consummation ceremony. Your word could legitimize a king and a queen, and your word could also, as in the case of Henry VIII, be used to challenge a marriage and a dynasty. So, you're standing there, a powerful courtier, with a weight of responsibility on your shoulders. You are a witness, a guarantor, a legal expert, and a political operator, all rolled into one. Your duty is to protect the interests of the crown and to ensure the future of the dynasty. It's a strange and uncomfortable job, but it is one of the most important jobs in the kingdom. You are a crucial cog in the Tudor machine, and your presence is a testament to the strange and wonderful ways that power, politics, and a bizarre ritual intertwined in this fascinating period of history. While the witnesses, with their high-ranking titles and solemn faces, provided the political and legal heft to the consummation, there was another crucial figure in the room, the doctor. You are now in the medical tent of the Tudor court, a place of strange remedies and even stranger beliefs. The doctor's involvement in the consummation was a sign of the Tudors' obsession with legitimacy, a desire to leave no stone unturned in their quest for a bulletproof dynasty. The doctor's role was to provide a medical affidavit, a professional opinion on the consummation. A mainstream historical fact is that the doctor, often a highly respected physician, would be called upon to examine the Queen after the consummation to confirm her virginity and to provide a report on her physical condition. This was not a pleasant duty, but it was a crucial part of the ritual. The doctor's affidavit, with its scientific for the time language and its professional authority, was a powerful piece of evidence, a final confirmation of the consummation. It was a way to add a layer of objective, medical fact to an event that was otherwise based on human testimony and political maneuvering. The doctor's involvement was particularly important in cases where the consummation was challenged. In the case of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the doctor's affidavit was a crucial part of the legal proceedings. Henry's lawyers argued that the marriage had been consummated, and they used the testimony of a doctor to support their claims. The doctor's affidavit, with its scientific language and its professional authority, was a powerful piece of evidence, a final confirmation of the consummation. It was a way to add a layer of objective, medical fact to an event that was otherwise based on human testimony and political maneuvering. A fringe tidbit: there's an account of a doctor who, after examining a queen, wrote a detailed report describing not only her physical condition but also her emotional state, a testament to the doctor's deep understanding of the psychological toll of the consummation. The doctor's affidavit was also a way to protect the queen. In a world where a queen's virginity was a matter of state, a doctor's professional opinion was a way to protect her from false accusations. A queen who was accused of not being a virgin could be returned to her home country in disgrace, and her family could be politically ruined. The doctor's affidavit was a way to protect her from this fate, a final confirmation of her honor and her fitness to be a queen. It was a strange and uncomfortable job, but it was a crucial one. So, you're standing there, a doctor in the Tudor court, tasked with a bizarre and uncomfortable duty. You are there to provide a medical affidavit, a professional opinion on the consummation. You are a crucial piece of the Tudor machine, a cog in the wheel of power, and your presence is a testament to the strange and wonderful ways that medicine and politics intertwined in this fascinating period of history. The doctor's affidavit was a powerful piece of evidence, a final confirmation of the consummation, and a powerful reminder that in the Tudor court, every detail, no matter how personal, was a matter of state. The consummation was not just a political event. It was also a social one, a time of strange and delightful customs that have long since faded into history. You're now a guest at the Tudor wedding feast, a place of bawdy songs, lavish food, and a very peculiar gift. The morning after the consummation, there was a tradition of gifting a special gown to the new queen, a custom that was both a celebration and a powerful political statement. The gifting of a gown, known as the chemise de la reine, was a tradition that had its origins in continental Europe, but it was enthusiastically adopted by the Tudors. A mainstream historical fact is that this was a beautiful and expensive garment, often made of fine silk or linen, and it was given to the queen by her new husband, the king. The gown was a symbol of the king's love and his gratitude for her. Having successfully performed her royal duty, it was a public and joyous occasion, a way to celebrate the consummation and to show the world that the marriage was a success. The gown was not just a piece of clothing. It was a powerful political symbol. It was a sign that the queen had successfully completed her duty and that a new Tudor heir was on the way. The gifting of the gown was a way to announce the success of the consummation to the world without explicitly saying it. It was a subtle but powerful piece of political theatre, a fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Tudor queen who was so proud of her new gown that she wore it for days, a testament to her joy and her relief at having successfully performed her duty. The gown was a trophy, a banner, a testament to a job well done. The gifting of the gown was also a way to secure the queen's loyalty and her affection, in a world where a queen's primary duty was to produce a male heir. The gifting of a beautiful gown was a way for the king to show that he valued her as a person, not just as a vessel for his children. It was a small but powerful act of kindness. In a world that was often brutal and cold, the gown was a symbol of a new beginning, a new life, and a new dynasty. So you're standing there, a guest at the Tudor wedding feast, watching as the king gifts a beautiful gown to his new queen. You are a witness to a bizarre and beautiful custom, a custom that was both a celebration of love and a powerful political statement. The gifting of the gown was a sign of the times, a testament to the strange and wonderful ways that power, politics, and a bizarre ritual intertwined in this fascinating period of history. It was a moment of profound joy, a time when a queen's body was a matter of state, just as her father's had been, and the gown was a symbol of that, a beautiful and powerful piece of political theatre. The public spectacle of the consummation was a crucial element of Tudor political life, but it was also a deeply personal event, and the physical evidence of its success was treated with a reverence that seems almost bizarre to us today. You're now a lady-in-waiting, a close confidant of the Queen, and you are tasked with a very specific and very strange duty, hiding the evidence. This wasn't about shame or modesty. It was about preservation, a way to protect a powerful political symbol from being tampered with or stolen. The evidence, as you recall, was the stained sheet. This was a pristine white sheet, carefully chosen and placed on the bed for this specific purpose. After the witnesses had left, it was your duty to carefully remove the sheet and take it to a secure location. A mainstream historical fact is that this sheet would then be carefully preserved and stored away in the royal archives, a permanent record of the consummation. It was a crucial piece of evidence, a final confirmation of the consummation, and it was treated with a reverence that seems strange to us today. It was a symbol of a new beginning, a new life, and a new dynasty. The act of hiding the evidence was not just a practical one. It was a deeply symbolic one. It was a way to protect the Queen and her reputation from scandal and from false accusations. In a world where a queen's virginity was a matter of state, a doctor's professional opinion was a way to protect her from false accusations. A queen who was accused of not being a virgin could be returned to her home country in disgrace, and her family could be politically ruined. The doctor's affidavit was a way to protect her from this fate, a final confirmation of her honor and her fitness to be a queen. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Tudor queen who, after a successful consummation, was so proud of her new gown that she wore it for days, a testament to her joy and her relief at having successfully performed her duty. The preservation of the sheet was a way to ensure that the evidence would be there if it was ever needed again. As you recall from the story of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, the question of whether or not the marriage had been consummated was a matter of life and death, of political alliances, and of the very future of the English Church. The sheet, had it been preserved, would have been a powerful piece of evidence, a final and undeniable confirmation of the consummation. But in this case, it was a piece of evidence that was lost to history, and its absence led to a political and religious firestorm. The act of hiding the evidence was, in a way, an act of historical revisionism, a way to control the narrative and to ensure that the story of the consummation was told in a way that was favorable to the crown. You're standing there, a lady in waiting, with a stained sheet in your hands. You are a witness to a bizarre and intimate custom, a custom that was both a celebration of love and a powerful political statement. The preservation of the sheet was a sign of the times, a testament to the strange and wonderful ways that power, politics, and a bizarre ritual intertwined in this fascinating period of history. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a time when a queen's body was a matter of state, just as her father's had been. A royal marriage was an event of immense political and economic significance, a union of two powerful families. As a diplomat, you are privy to the intricate negotiations that precede the wedding. One of the most critical components of this agreement was the power of the dowry, the wealth and property that the bride's family brought to the marriage. A successful consummation was not just about producing a legitimate heir. It was the final, non-negotiable step in a massive financial transaction. A mainstream historical fact is that the dowry of a royal bride could be a massive sum of money, a large piece of land, or a powerful political alliance. In the case of Catherine of Aragon, her dowry was so massive that Henry VII was loath to give it up, even after her husband, his son Arthur, had died. The dowry was a symbol of the bride's value, a measure of her political importance, and a powerful piece of evidence that the marriage was real. The consummation was the moment when the dowry was officially transferred from her family to her new husband. A powerful and public act of state. This wasn't a gift. It was a contract. The connection between the consummation and the dowry was a way to ensure that the marriage was not just a legal contract, but also a physical and financial one. The dowry was a powerful incentive for the king to consummate the marriage, and the consummation was a powerful disincentive for him to seek an annulment. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Tudor king who, after a successful consummation, was so happy that he gave a massive feast for his new wife's family, a testament to his joy and his gratitude for the massive dowry she had brought with her. The consummation was not just a personal act. It was a political and financial one, a powerful reminder that in the Tudor court, everything was for sale, even love. The consummation was a ritual of exchange, a moment when the bride and her family gave up their claim to her wealth and property, and transferred it to the king. It was a moment of profound trust, a trust that was sealed with a public act of intimacy. Without the consummation, the dowry could be returned to the bride's family, and the king would lose a massive amount of wealth and a powerful political alliance. This was the reason why the annulment of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon was so complicated. The dowry was still in English hands, and the Spanish were demanding it back. The annulment was not just a legal and religious matter. It was also a financial one, a massive political and economic headache that would take years to resolve. The marriage bed was, in a way, a bank vault. The dowry was deposited, and the consummation was the key that locked it in place. The whole affair was a bizarre and powerful combination of politics, finance, and human intimacy. The bedding ceremony, the stained sheet, and the doctor's affidavit were all parts of a larger narrative that was being told across Europe. The Tudors simply took that narrative and made it their own, adding their own unique blend of drama, paranoia, and political savvy. The public witnessing of the consummation was a sign of the times, a testament to the interconnectedness of the European royal families and the relentless quest for power and legitimacy that defined the age. While the Tudors were busy with their bizarre public consummation rituals, what was going on with everyone else? You're now a simple farmer, a merchant, or a tradesman, a common person in Tudor England, and your courtship and wedding look nothing like the royal spectacle. The commoner's courtship and marriage was a world away from the high-stakes political drama of the court, a world where love, or at least a practical arrangement, was the main driver. A mainstream historical fact is that, for most people, marriage was a practical affair. It was about securing a household, a trade, or a piece of land. Love was a bonus, not a requirement. Courtship was a much more private and personal affair, a time of conversation, of gifts, and of a simple promise to marry. There were no public consummations, no bishops and diplomats waiting in the wings, and certainly no doctor's affidavit. The marriage was a simple ceremony in a church, and the consummation was a private, personal affair, a matter of the heart, not of the state. The contrast between the royal and commoner experience is striking. For the king and queen, the wedding was a political act. For the commoner, it was a social one, a fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Tudor farmer who wrote in his diary that he was so happy with his new wife that he took her on a long walk through the fields. A simple and powerful act of love that was a world away from the royal bedchamber. The commoner's courtship was a time of simple joys, a time of quiet moments and shared dreams. It was a world that was a world away from the royal spectacle, a world where love, or at least a practical arrangement, was the main driver. The commoner's courtship was also a time of negotiation. The father of the bride would often negotiate with the groom over the dowry, a simple payment in money, goods, or land that the bride would bring to the marriage. But this was a private affair, a handshake between two men, not a massive political and financial transaction that was open to public scrutiny. The consummation was a simple, private act, a moment when the couple officially became man and wife in the eyes of God and their community. So, while the king and queen were busy with their bizarre public consummation rituals, the common people of Tudor England were getting on with their lives. Their courtship was a world away from the high-stakes political drama of the court, a world where love, or at least a practical arrangement, was the main driver. Their weddings were simple, personal affairs, a celebration of a new beginning and a new life. It was a world that was a world away from the royal spectacle, a world where love, or at least a practical arrangement, was the main driver. Beyond the public consummation, the Tudors had a host of other strange wedding customs, rituals that seem bizarre to us today. You're now a guest at another royal wedding, but this time you're paying attention to the smaller, more personal details. One of the most striking of these customs was the absence of a simple act of affection, the lack of kissing during the wedding ceremony. A mainstream historical fact is that a Tudor wedding ceremony was a deeply religious and legal affair, but it was not a romantic one. There was no kiss at the end of the ceremony, no moment of tender affection to seal the deal. The kiss was reserved for the public consummation, the moment when the king and queen were officially declared man and wife. This was a world where a kiss was a private act, a show of affection that was not meant for public consumption. The lack of a kiss in the ceremony was a powerful reminder that a royal marriage was a political act, not a romantic one. The absence of a kiss in the ceremony was also a sign of the times. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Tudor courtier who wrote in his diary that he found it strange that the king and queen would not kiss at the end of the ceremony, a testament to the changing attitudes towards love and affection in Tudor England. The Tudors were a passionate and emotional people, but their public lives were deeply constrained by the rules of protocol and political necessity. The lack of a kiss in the ceremony was a reflection of this, a reminder that in the Tudor court, love was a private matter, and the wedding was a public one. The lack of a kiss in the ceremony was a way to keep the focus on the legal and religious aspects of the marriage. The ceremony was all about the vows, the rings, and the legal contract. It was a time of solemnity and reverence, a time to ask for God's blessing on the union. The consummation, with its public witnessing and its celebratory atmosphere, was the time for the celebration of the physical union. It was a bizarre and powerful combination of the sacred and the profane, a reminder that in the Tudor court, everything was a performance, a piece of political theatre. So you're standing there, a guest at a Tudor wedding, and you're waiting for the kiss that never comes. You are a witness to a bizarre and beautiful custom, a custom that was both a celebration of love and a powerful political statement. The lack of a kiss in the ceremony was a sign of the times, a testament to the strange and wonderful ways that power, politics, and a bizarre ritual intertwined in this fascinating period of history. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a time when a queen's body was a matter of state, just as her father's had been. The public witnessing of the consummation was a bizarre and powerful custom, but, like all things, it eventually faded away. You are now in a new century, a time of new monarchs and new ideas, and you are witnessing the legacy of a lost custom. What happened to this strange ritual, and why did it eventually fall out of favor? The answer is a fascinating mix of changing social norms, political realities, and a shift in the nature of kingship itself. Mainstream. Historical fact is that the custom of public consummation slowly died out after the Tudor period. Who succeeded the Tudors were less concerned with the legitimacy of their dynasty and more concerned with the political and religious divisions that had torn the kingdom apart. They were also more interested in the idea of a private life, a separation between the king's body and the body of the state. The bedding ceremony, with its bawdy songs and public toasts, was seen as a relic of a bygone era, a bit of an embarrassing and outdated custom that was no longer necessary. The custom also fell out of favor because it was no longer needed. The Tudor dynasty, for all its drama and its bloodshed, had established a clear line of succession. The Stuarts inherited a kingdom that was, at least on paper, more stable and more secure. The fear of a succession crisis, the fear that had driven the Tudors to such extremes, was no longer the primary concern. The focus of the kingdom shifted from the bedchamber to the council chamber, and the public witnessing of the consummation was left behind, a relic of a more dramatic and more dangerous time. A fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Stuart courtier who wrote in his diary that he found the idea of a public consummation horrifying and a barbaric custom, a testament to the changing attitudes towards privacy and intimacy in the 17th century. The legacy of the lost custom is also a testament to the changing nature of kingship. The Tudors were a dynasty that was obsessed with the body of the king, his health, his virility, and his ability to produce an heir. The Stuarts, in contrast, were more interested in the idea of a king as a political and religious leader, a head of a commonwealth, not just a dynasty. The public witnessing of the consummation was a ritual of the body, a ritual that was completely incompatible with the new, more spiritual and more political idea of kingship. The king was no longer just a man, he was a symbol, a living embodiment of the state, and his private life was no longer subject to public scrutiny. So, you're in a new era, a time of new monarchs and new ideas, and you are witnessing the legacy of a lost custom. The public witnessing of the Consummation was a bizarre and powerful custom, but it was a custom of a time that was defined by a fear of a succession crisis. With the end of the Tudor dynasty, that fear was gone, and the custom was no longer needed. The king's body was now a symbol of his kingdom, and his private actions were no longer subject to public scrutiny. He was a king who had finally broken free from the cage of his gender and the expectations of his time. The public witnessing of the Consummation is a story that feels almost fictional to us, a bizarre and unbelievable custom from a time that seems both distant and familiar. You're now in the present day, a world of privacy, of personal autonomy, and of a very different understanding of sex and marriage. The modern perception of this custom is a fascinating mix of fascination, repulsion, and a kind of historical awe. A mainstream historical fact is that we, in the present, tend to view this custom through the lens of our own values. We see it as a violation of privacy, a horrifying breach of personal autonomy, and a crude and barbaric custom. We are repulsed by the idea of a couple having to perform their most intimate act in front of a crowd of strangers, and we are horrified by the idea of a woman's body being a matter of state. We see it as a symbol of a brutal and patriarchal era, a time when a king's power was absolute and a woman's worth was tied to her ability to produce an heir. But our modern perception is also a bit simplistic, a fringe tidbit. There's an account of a contemporary historian who argues that the public consummation was not just a symbol of patriarchy, but also a form of protection for the queen. By publicly proving her virginity and her fertility, she was protected from false accusations and from being returned to her home country in disgrace. The ritual, in a strange and convoluted way, was a form of political insurance for the queen, a way to secure her place in the court and in the kingdom. Our modern perception of privacy and autonomy can sometimes blind us to the complexities of the past. The modern perception of this custom is also a testament to how far we have come. The idea of a public consummation is so alien to us that it feels like something out of a fantasy novel. We live in a world where marriage is, for the most part, a matter of love, not a political or economic transaction. We live in a world where a woman's worth is not tied to her ability to produce an heir. We live in a world where a king's body is not the body of the state. The public witnessing of the consummation is a powerful reminder of how much has changed in just a few hundred years, a testament to the progress of our society. So, you're in the present day, a world of privacy and personal autonomy, and you are reflecting on a bizarre and unbelievable custom from a time that seems both distant and familiar. The public witnessing of the consummation is a story that feels almost fictional to us, but it was a reality for the Tudors. It was a custom that was both a symbol of a brutal and patriarchal era and a form of protection for the queen. It was a custom that was both a horrifying breach of personal autonomy and a necessary part of a massive political and economic transaction. It was a custom that was both a testament to the brutal realities of power and a reminder of how far we have come. As we dim the lights on this journey through the Tudor court, let's take a final moment to reflect on the lasting Tudor bedtime and its reverberations throughout history. We've seen a bizarre ritual, a powerful political tool, and a deeply personal ordeal, all wrapped up in the heavy velvet curtains of a royal bedchamber. The public witnessing of the consummation was a custom that was at once terrifying and fascinating, a powerful reminder of how different the past was from our present. A mainstream historical fact is that this custom, though it faded, left a lasting legacy. It taught the Tudors and their successors that legitimacy was not just a matter of birthright, but a matter of public performance. It was a lesson that Henry VIII took to heart, using the ambiguity of his brother's consummation to justify a massive religious schism. It was a lesson that Mary I learned the hard way, as her unfulfilled desire for a child left her kingdom in turmoil. And it was a lesson that Elizabeth I, in her own way, rejected, as she chose to be a queen of the mind, not of the body. The custom may have died out, but its legacy lives on in the annals of history, a powerful reminder of a time when the personal was always political, a fringe tidbit. There's an account of a Tudor queen who, on her deathbed, asked for the bedsheets from her wedding night to be brought to her. She wanted to be reminded of a time when she was a young bride, a time when she had a whole life ahead of her, a time when she was still a princess, not a queen. This small, intimate detail is a powerful reminder that behind the politics and the power, there were human beings with their own fears, anxieties, and desires. The public consummation was a brutal and dehumanizing ritual, but for some, it was also a moment of hope, a time when they were just a bride, not a queen. The final Tudor bedtime is a story of power, of politics, and of a bizarre ritual that was a sign of its time. It was a time when a king's body was the body of the state, a time when a queen's worth was tied to her ability to produce an heir. It was a time when the most private of acts was a public spectacle, a time when the personal was always political. It was a time that feels both distant and familiar, a time that we can only imagine from the comfort of our modern lives, now. As the candle flickers and the shadows lengthen, let's leave the Tudor court behind. The heavy velvet curtains have been drawn for the last time. The witnesses have gone home, the dowry has been secured, and the legacy of a lost custom has been written in the annals of history. The king and queen are asleep, and the silence of the bedchamber is a stark contrast to the drama of the day. The journey is over, the story is told, and the past is at rest. As you drift off to sleep, let the images of the past fade into the night. The heavy oak bed, the flickering candlelight, the hushed whispers of the witnesses. Let the stories of power, of politics, and of a bizarre ritual that was a sign of its time fade into a gentle hum. The past is not just a collection of facts. It is a tapestry of human experience, a story that we can still feel and a time that we can still imagine. Sleep now, my friend. The Tudors are at rest. The long night is here. Sweet dreams.